Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with our weekly Q&A thing. It is a YouTube video. It is a podcast. It is nothing else, but it's important to you if you're listening, or it's not. It's something that you put on in the background.
I don't know that you have to
categorize
it.
Content.
It could be just its own thing.
It's a thing that you've clicked on. There's been at least one. There's this idea called like degrees of friction. Which is just how much work it takes for you to do stuff. So for example, like ordering online, maybe like typing in your credit card manually versus having it autofill, right? Would be two different degrees of friction. And it matters quite a bit. Amazon actually patented their one-click buy. And one of the big things that made Amazon more valuable is that a higher percentage of people who put stuff into their cart will buy it if it's on Amazon because of that one click. So degrees of friction are this really small thing that end up being in aggregate very useful. And so that's a long way of saying if you are here, you have there's at least 1 degree of friction that you've gone through to make it to this video, right? Or podcast. You've clicked on it, you've done something to get here. And that's kind of cool. So
okay.
I'll say that it's no matter what this video means to you, it means 1 degree of friction worth of value to you. Yeah. But anyways, you have some stuff. We oftentimes like to start this out and anchor this in sort of what's going on in the world, just because we can talk about whatever we want. Yeah. And you've got some stuff you want to talk about.
Yeah. And before I get that, to just make it at least, nominally about injustice, we were watching The Team with a character that's probably going to be in the challenge this Thursday when the new challenge comes out.
Yeah.
And we can talk about it more later, but if we don't get to it, we'll be talking about it a lot Thursday. So the top of mind, clearly, as a Canadian now, is this trade war with the U.S. And just to remind people who are watching this in future and it's the distant past, or even just letting people know who maybe don't really care or pay attention as much. Trump announced a bunch of tariffs on Canada, 25% across the board, and 10%, with the exception of only 10% on oil and gas, because, the U.S. needs Canada's oil and gas. And after, a little bit of posturing, a little bit of whatever, Monday morning, the president of Mexico phones Trump and they have a nice conversation. He withdraws the tariffs. Then later, was it later Monday or maybe this morning? Something, late Monday, another phone call with Justin Trudeau, who's the Prime Minister of Canada, and then again delay the tariffs again for another month. And I think it's weird to me that, the number of people who don't understand what's going on, not even like the subtle behind the scenes, like not behind the scenes so much as the underlying sort of unspoken intention, right? When they say, yeah, it's about drugs and illegal immigrants and stuff, it's ridiculous. Like nobody who has any kind of sense of what's really happening believes that. Some people might believe it because they just listen to whatever their leader says and believes it because they're...
Yeah, well, the drugs question is interesting when you look at like the statistics and metrics for drugs flowing into the U.S. from each border, right? And how disproportionate it is for the Canadian versus Mexican border. Wow. And that's not to say anything about sort of the reasons or anything more complicated, right? The totally non-nuanced piece of information is that there are orders of magnitude more drugs flowing in from their southern borders than their northern one.
But let's even ignore that. If we look just at the Canadian-U.S. border, there's more drugs flowing the other way into Canada from the U.S. than is going to the U.S. There's more guns flowing the other way. There's more not legal migrants flowing the other way. And let's ignore that, though. Let's say that the numbers don't even matter. If we did that and we ignored that, think about it. Whose responsibility is it to, if you want to decide what's coming across your border, why do we go through that the whole theatrics on the airplane of customs clearance. Yeah. If you really are letting somebody else take responsibility for something that actually matters to you.
Yeah.
And then you bring that back and layer it on, well, you're going to only do a 10% tariff on China where more drugs come from than like it is so that's sort of the subtext, right? Like it's just it's a pretense, it's a pretext for announcing these things to try to leverage something out of Canada. Whatever that is, who knows? But it's clearly, for anybody who's paying attention, a ploy.
And well, he's just threatening tariffs over and over and over again, right?
Right.
Like it's a clear sort of playbook that he's established. And I think that the thing is that in some cases it seems like it may be working, right? You can throw your weight around a little bit with a threat, but it's interesting to me because I think, there are sanctions, right? Which, and other sort of country treatments that are clearly meant as sort of punishments or restrictions on the basis of behavior, right? And sort of sanctions are meant to hurt the other country but kind of hurt you a little bit too, right? There's the cost of not doing trade where you otherwise would be choosing to, right? It's a limitation. And so the idea of just imposing tariffs as like obviously as like a punitive measure, really is odd, right? Because it's not that tariffs have absolutely no value at all, right? But the way that he's threatening tariffs just feels like it would be, if you're doing tariffs smartly, right? I think my understanding is that the underlying value of them is that you are giving a competitive advantage to local production and manufacturing, right?
Well, yes.
Relative to...
All right, so that's one factor, but the other factor is what you're trying to do is also encourage international investment in your country. Like you can say it's to encourage local business, but a lot of local business just don't have the resources, capital, or capacity to do it. The other thing is, you want if some international company is looking to invest in some place, they will want to invest in a place where it will give them access to a bigger market, right? And when you're a country that's a large enough country that's protected by tariffs, which is the States, like if it's a small country, that's not even on the table, right? Like nobody, if you've got a bunch of tariffs that are
so invest in what capacity, like bring manufacturing there, or
So listen, a smaller country in the States, that's not a consideration, right? Like if you want in on this sort of protected enclosed environment, then you need to build capacity there.
Yeah.
And if it's a small enough market, then they just don't care.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the other thing that's happening.
Yeah, so that's the theoretical value of tariffs, but the way that he's looking to apply them across the board, extreme and in short term, right, really increases the cost hugely for consumers. It reduces the sort of demand and trade, so it hurts Canadian businesses or whatever country is talking about imposing tariffs with. It's not a sort of long-term smart strategy with a targeted outcome. It's just it's a threat, right? It's a cudgel.
It ruins the relationships. I mean, I can't even remember what the terms were, but when you talk about negotiations, if you don't care about the long term, if you're only looking at this one negotiation in isolation, who cares? It's fine. You win it. That's it.
It's like game theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I like about the discussion now, though, is I'm seeing more of the one thing that I've been suggesting, which was one way you can respond to tariff is with export tax. So clearly, when you say you're putting a tariff of 25% on everything and only 10% on this one thing, that one thing matters because whoever's imposing tariffs, unless they're really clueless, will recognize it hurts your own local consumers.
Yeah.
They will be paying more because the money that the U.S. government is taking in tariffs from the importer means that it's the consumer, the ultimate consumer is going to be paying a higher price for everything.
Yeah.
So an export tax, you know what? If you're going to try to put a lower tariff because it's something that matters to you,
you're trying to extract value at a government level on the receiving end.
Yeah, we're going to do it on the sending end.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense because here's the thing. with oil and energy and whatever, the ability of the refineries in the States to handle something other than the crude that comes from Canada, you can't build up that capacity fast. And if you're going to do and have impact, right? Because one, you want to recover some money. Two, you want to be able to respond in kind so that the person who's trying to inflict pain on you feels a bit of the same pain. I think it totally makes sense. And the weird thing is, because there's this delay of another month, ultimately there may never be a tariff, right? Like there's a talk of it, but it might ultimately be just the threat of it. It's still chaos. And the problem with chaos is you can't plan properly. What it means is that the negotiated free trade agreement that was supposed to be one of the big deals during Trump's first presidency was his, he did such a bigly successful negotiation that's in favor of the U.S. It goes out the window. It means nothing. And so the interesting thing to me is that, have you heard the term emerging markets?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's the idea that there are relatively young markets where there's a huge amount of potential and there's a huge amount of risk, but not necessarily for the reasons you think. Emerging markets often are in places where there's not a lot of regulation, there's not a lot of government oversight, and there's a lot of stuff like bribery. Like there's a lot of sort of local kind of things that you have to do that's different than normal sort of regulated business. And the upside is the potential return is great. The downside is you could lose your shirt for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with how good your business is. And it occurs to me that this is very much creating the atmosphere of an emerging market where you don't know what you can rely on when you're negotiating a contract. Listen, free trade agreement, right? Like this was the whole point of trying to make sure that neighbors, people who are really close to each other physically, benefit from the closeness of the relationship by making it easier to trade. I guess there's so many things that jump into my head about the kind of points I made. And I think another one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is how the trade deficit is being characterized. And let's ignore the fact about whether it actually means that somebody's in debt, because it really doesn't, right? Like when you buy more than goods and services than you sell, you're still getting stuff. You're getting stuff that you wanted, that you paid money for. And so let's ignore whether that's actually true, because if you exclude specifically oil and gas, Canada's in a net trade deficit with the US anyways. So it's all that stuff. And, if you wanted to just fix the trade deficit, you know what? Just don't buy any oil and gas. Not going to happen. But being a net consumer, I think, of goods is actually a good thing. Because when you rely on exporting resources, there's a limit. Like Canada selling wood, paper, minerals, that puts them closer to, I don't know what the new term is, but it puts them closer to what would traditionally be called a third world country, where they're relying on,
I think you say developing country?
Developing country. All right, so then Canada is more like a developing country. And what you actually aspire to is that what you produce for other people are services, that you have the expertise to generate income by selling your abilities instead of selling things. Your abilities, you maintain. They don't go away. Well, you can't run out of it.
There's a few levels too, because also I think on average more affluent countries tend to be more consumptive, right? They use more energy, they use more resources, they tend to create a lot more per capita emissions, right? So the idea that you would be needing more from other people, right? In terms
not
of
needing that, you can afford
stuff,
to buy more from other people.
That's true, but in terms of needing and using more stuff, I'm assuming that if it's a trade deficit too, you're also not taking into account per capita, right? The same way, where it's our exporting of resources, right? If it's oil and gas, especially, right, is based, some around our human effort, but I think a lot of that is based around the fact that it's our land masses, right? Because you know, you have these like orders of magnitudes of efficiency where we're using like tools, right, to extract increasing like amounts of resources from the land. And it's more of like, we have a lot of land mass, right? We've got more land mass in the US and we have less people. So, you know, we've got a lot of resources that are coming out of the ground, right? That we don't have as much people to use, literally.
Yeah. I'm just going to, something you said just a little bit earlier has been sort of percolating in my head a little bit about the resource. And I'm not necessarily sure that a developed versus a developing country has that kind of clear boundary of who's going to be consuming more stuff and generating more emissions and whatever. Because at one point, as you're developing, that's going to be a driver for using stuff.
Yeah.
And generating garbage. And at the tail end, you might not be, when you're developed, you might not be using that stuff and generating a lot of junk to become more developed, but you end up using and doing that because
I think
of
it's just the way the
entertainment
numbers
stuff.
bear out. I think at the very least, Americans use like per capita a large amount of emissions and are like very consumptive.
Sure, but so does China.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and that was with the whole, like they're building up their capacity
to
actually do stuff, like, because not as well, maybe I shouldn't say not as well regulated. It's the government's the one driving it, so they don't care nearly as much, right? But I think Americans, because they just use a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And there's both ways. It depends on how far you get into the consumption part and how much you use. Yeah. And that's still modifiable. I don't know. It's just, in my mind, like the whole argument that somehow it's a bad thing, not only characterizing it incorrectly as it's a deficit. It's not a deficit. It just means on the balance you're using more. And I think a lot of places that get to become the most developed aspire to not be selling stuff that you will eventually run out of.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's a weird thing to me. And I hope it plays out differently, but I think the damage has been done and there's a certain amount that you can't put back into the bottle.
There's a certain cost in public trust. I've seen a bunch of my friends talk about the fact that they're surprised how wide-reaching people, you know, wanting to stop buying U.S. goods and services is, and like how much it seemed to really have like
galvanized us.
Yeah, that you're seeing a lot more Canadian nationalism, I think, than in most other circumstances. And I think it really is just the way that this feels like, it feels like an act of aggression. It feels like an act of betrayal.
It is. Oh, it totally is. It comes back to it's not rational. It's chaotic. It's arbitrary. And when the world doesn't make sense, I think it's almost a human imperative to want to try to make sense by imposing your own rational what's the word? I don't even know what I'm looking for. Like imposing your own structure, like
framework.
To it. Yeah. So that, listen, if we can't trust our neighbors to deal with us fairly, if we can't actually come to an agreement with them that actually they will stick to, then we need to be less reliant on them and we need to make ourselves less vulnerable in ways that they can exploit.
And I think one of the problems too with that is that on a governmental level, right, Trump can speak with Trudeau, right, and they can have a more amicable or more aggressive agreement, and then, you know, after the election, whoever is going to be in power, right, will have the relationship they have with Trump. But I think this loss of trust on the level of citizens, right, is very different, right? Where you can't, you know, Justin Trudeau couldn't come out tomorrow and say, hey guys, we should start buying American stuff again in grocery stores, right? Right. That has happened, right? And, you know...
You mean the boycotting or trying to buy Canadian?
Yeah. Or that value difference. That shift in motivations and goals, right, has changed. And I don't think that's as easily shifted back, right?
No, you can't.
Yeah. So I think there's definitely going to be like a cost, and the question is how marginal it is to Americans. And I think also like it can't happen the same way in the other direction because Trump is throwing his weight around to so many countries right now, right? That, you know, it's possible that Americans as a people could do the same thing and say, oh, we're going to stop buying any Canadian products we have in our stores, right? Yeah. But if Americans are doing that, there's, I think, a lot more restrictions, right? They're having these sort of they're fighting a war on like a million fronts right now, right? With a lot of different countries and governments, with especially just even with the tariffs alone, right? Or the threat of tariffs. So
right, because even the EU, for example, that might not be subjected to the same kind of tariffs, are still thinking, okay, so this is not a rational actor. We can't rely and plan around expectations a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. So they're going to try to insulate themselves from that kind of potential damage.
We're very much in the middle times right now, though. So I am interested in seeing how this shakes out in practice, right? Because I think that it becomes also increasingly hard to speculate on what the fallout is going to be when, he's going to keep doing new things, right? In 30 days, is it going to be delayed again, or is it going to go into effect, or what's the outcome, right? And so I think even like the impact of this specific thing is going to be really hard to tease out in the longer discussion of like all the, inter-country relations
for sure.
that happen.
Like I said, chaos.
Yeah.
That's not a good environment to plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we want to get into our first question this week?
Sure. A little bit late, but...
Okay, so, late in a couple reasons. So Edgar Castro 9966 says, Merry Christmas. I have a question I wanted to ask before I started a new account and need to know y'all's input. When starting a new account, would you focus on getting an OP character, then expanding the roster through the pack glitch, for example, Rebirth Jessica Cruz, etc., or would you recommend expanding the roster first? And what way would you go about expanding your roster when you finally get around to doing so?
It's interesting because this kind of... The question might be the same as it's always been, but the better answer has evolved over time.
Yeah. And this is slightly different because a lot of times people are like, where do I spend my money? And this is more of just saying, when you are getting characters, how should you prioritize getting characters?
I think the number one priority should absolutely be challenge characters.
Yeah.
That every week there's a new challenge character. When the game first started, challenge lasted for, I think, 3 weeks. There's a gap of maybe a week, 2 weeks in between. And it was harder to do that strategy. Mm-hmm. But I think for most people who are playing, unless you have trouble meeting the requirements.
Yeah.
And that's always within credits, right? Like that's a credit limitation.
I think for the first set of weeks or a month, maybe it might be hard to have either the requirements or the stats to fully complete the challenge, right? Yeah. So your real priority is rushing to a point where you can complete the challenge. What elite level and level do you need before you can start thinking about meaningfully completing the challenge? It's been so long that I don't really have a good sense of it.
But this is what I'm saying, though. It's a problem that can be solved with power credits. Because you can buy through the fights that you don't have the requirement or that you can't win.
Yeah.
And so then it still becomes... We can still reduce it back to how do you generate power credits fastest.
Yeah.
But when you're early on, the levels that are available to you that can give you a lot of credits just aren't there. Like bonus battle 6 is really it. It takes you a while to get there. And I think, though, that the challenge is what gives you the easiest access to... Because the challenge characters tend to be higher stat.
Yeah.
Even if they're not ideal. I mean, every week we go into each character and we talk about what their sort of shortcomings are.
Yeah.
But if you ignore... if you ignore multiplayer and you're looking really at working through the single player mode, then none of that matters because we're focusing on basic attacks, really. We need somebody with high stats. We need to be able to easily promote them. And that's probably the easiest way by just getting multiple copies of the same character.
It's true.
And so the challenge reset is great. More important than... What did they say? Through the pack glitch, for example. So the pack glitches. It takes too much time. It doesn't. The one thing I don't like about the pack glitch is you have to find that balance between you have to have enough credits where you're not resetting the game for just one pack.
Yeah.
And if you're getting to the level, I think you're spending a lot of time doing stuff in the game that has nothing to do with playing the game. You don't pick up the expertise or get that feel for how fights go.
Yeah.
And then you lose out on a lot, that half of the game that's not about collecting.
You also don't accumulate any resources. You just spend your resources more efficiently.
Right. So I think playing the challenge over and over at the normal level is probably the best thing that you can do. It's funny, right? It's the best glitch, I think, for any beginning player. and it's been the longest lasting glitch.
Yeah.
It was the first video. It was the first related thing that we did.
Yeah.
Was the challenge reset.
Mm-hmm.
It was the motivation for this channel, actually. So, I mean, if you're talking about what you should do in the game, I think there are a lot of things that you sort of rotate in and out. The important thing is to prioritize, and you really avoid striving for rewards that take too much time. For example, multiplayer, with the exception of absolutely game-changing gears. So in the week of Tentu Totem,
if you have enough time to get it, yeah, you should.
Yeah, it's worth prioritizing it at the expense of everything else in order to get Tentu Totem, because it will change completely the way you're able to play every aspect of the game.
Yeah.
And it comes, once you've got it, it doesn't come at any kind of, it doesn't make the game any less pleasant to play.
Yeah. And I think when you're expanding your roster, right, when you finally get around to doing so, I think the thing is when you really are just trying to fill out your roster, you're just kind of looking at like averages and law of large numbers and just buying out like sort of 1 million like gold packs and challenge packs, right?
Yeah.
Because the thing is that there's not specific packs that give you everybody. And if you're getting multiple copies of the same guy, then you run into the situation where eventually the cheapest way is going to be buying a bunch of gold packs. And then that just gives you more hits that you don't care about. Right.
Right.
So I think in terms of like, if you're going for a real sort of completionist perspective on it, it's just buying gold packs over and over and again.
I do like that. Actually, that's a very good point.
To hit the completionist level. Right. And that's one of the good things about the challenge. Is that if you're doing the challenge, you can sort of max out people one at a time, and you don't need to buy the challenge pack, right?
Right.
So
right, yeah, no. So that's a great point, right? At the moment you're in the game where you can actually generate a lot of credits, it changes how you play. But right at the beginning, you don't need to have so much money. Even the gold packs can be sometimes difficult because you're not necessarily getting the same characters over, which you want to promote them.
Yeah.
To make a really strong team. And putting in the time to complete the challenge generates so much in resources, whether it's the rewards after, second, third, fourth, and finally the fifth ladder. Yeah. But you're also not having to get too high in the fights, like whichever bonus battle you want to farm. So you don't actually have to be that good.
It's massively more time efficient. If you're looking at the best way to get like a single really good character, there's nothing that gets you there a fraction as fast as just doing the challenge over and over again.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's giving you other packs, other money, right? Like other things at the same time. It's just by far the best bang for your buck at an early stage of the game.
And it gets better each time you do it.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing is you're promoting them. So even if you buy, I agree with you that getting the gold pack is a great way to fill out your roster because it gives you more characters to play. It gives you more teams that you can work with. But if you want to really sort of motor through a lot of the single player offline game part, having Elite 5 or Elite 7 character that's a challenge character makes your life so much easier.
So that, I think, is the goal, is, get a couple of gold characters to the point where you can complete the challenge. Because I think the other thing, too, is that the value of it goes way down when you do have to start considering buying them out. Yeah. I think it still is ultimately worth it if you can do most of it without. But if you have to, do it over, if you're trying to complete it over and over again, and you're buying out, a whole ladder, right? The math becomes a lot worse.
Yeah.
And then it's just, grinding that out. But that does take you a while.
But once you get a few copies, we're not talking about the requirement. We're just talking about the firepower to actually get through the challenge. Mm-hmm. Once you've actually done it a few times, you're going to have
somebody who
promoted who's somebody strong enough to carry the team to just meet the requirements.
As long as you have the requirements.
I still remember maybe the first or second week. I can't remember which it was the first or second challenge. Sorry, that we were doing the challenge reset was either Wonder Woman 600 or Apocalypse Dark Side. Or not, maybe, it was regular Dark Side. Mm-hmm. And I got the absolute worst cramps in my arms.
Because you just done it over and over and over again.
I had tennis elbow and golfer's elbow at the same time. Yeah. From just playing over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. To play through the challenge, reset it, then play through the challenge and reset it. And when it was 3 weeks, I would have so many copies. And the other part is when you got copies, you can sell them.
And it still is the most efficient resource collection method at any given time.
It is the most. It's more efficient than Bonus Battle 6 for generating credits, but it is not as good for for leveling up your characters, because the fights in the normal difficulty challenge, their levels are too low to get the maximum kind of benefit from it.
Yeah, so there we go.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good place to end it off for the week.
Oh, you know what? Maybe one really quick one. The next one, I think, from Yarik Singh.
Yeah, they said, how do I avoid getting online rewards early glitch?
So I already responded to this in the comment directly, but I'm going to put the link in the description of this week's video. Read it, because you need to know ahead of time. You have to be prepared, because if you make a mistake when it happens and you're in a panic and you don't actually know what to do, it'll be too late.
So prepping yourself with that knowledge is more important than for a lot of other glitches. Okay,
yeah,
there we go.
And that I should give credit to the author. It was Devlin16, one of the mods on the Injustice subreddit, who has contributed a huge amount of the knowledge that is available.
Yeah. So there we go. To finish up, we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our lovely patrons on Patreon. That is Michael Devries, Irvin, Ruiz, Hoshi127, and Nora Klimek on the credited level. We'd also like to thank all of you for watching. We'll see you next week.
Komoda.